Welcome back, Squad. The time has come for me to weigh in on the most pressing and divisive issue of our time. Was Túrin Turambar, the tragic protagonist of the tale of the Children of Hurin, actually cursed, or was he just a headstrong moron? I've somehow acquired a bit of a reputation for coming down pretty hard on Túrin, but contrary to appearances, I really don't hate the guy. Tolkien probably devotes more time to developing Túrin's character than he gives to any other hero of the First Age. And he writes about him in a style that combines the elevated mythic tone of the Silmarillion with the more novelistic techniques that allow for closer identification with the characters. The result has a unique potential to devastate a reader, and thus I joke about Túrin in part because it's just too painful for me to care about him. But the other reason is that Túrin is a hugely frustrating character to read about, even in a book that's mostly about damaged individuals making objectively terrible choices and the inevitable fallout of said choices. Just in case you've managed to successfully block the story from your memory, here's the highlights. Hurin Thalion, a great warrior of men, is captured by Morgoth during a disastrous battle that will become known as the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, or Unnumbered Tears. Hurin is an ally of the Noldor Elves and has some knowledge of the hidden elven kingdom of Gondolin, which at this point is one of the last remaining realms not overrun by Morgoth's forces. Hurin naturally refuses to share any of this with Morgoth, so in revenge, Morgoth declares that he will place a curse on Hurin's family, his wife Morwen, his young son Turin, and his soon-to-be-born daughter Nienor. Hurin is chained to a mountaintop and given supernatural sight so he can see exactly what happens to his loved ones. To keep Turin safe, Morwen decides to send him to Doriath, where Thingol takes him on as his foster son. Morwen and Nienor, however, stay behind. Turin thus grows up having never met his sister, and this will, unfortunately, prove to be an important detail. Turin becomes a valiant and skilled warrior, but misfortune dogs his steps. He is mistakenly accused of murder, gets involved with some very bad people, accidentally kills his best friend Beleg during a botched rescue mission, and gets his other friend, Gwyndor, killed when his arrogance and battle lust lead to the destruction of the entire realm of Nargothrond by the dragon Glaurung. Eventually, he ends up in the Forest of Brethil and assumes a new identity, hoping to quietly live out the rest of his life without ruining anyone else's. Meanwhile, Morwen and Nienor do eventually arrive in Doriath, and when they hear of Turin's involvement in the sack of Nargothrond, they go there, hoping to pick up his trail and reunite with him. But there, Nienor runs into Glaurung, who puts a spell of amnesia and terror on her. Maddened, she runs into the woods and collapses in Brethil, where Turin finds her. Nienor has wholly lost her memory, including her true name, and Turin has never met her before, so naturally they fall in love and get married. Soon Glaurung approaches Brethil and Turin slays him in a daring ambush, getting knocked out in the process. His wife finds him beside Glaurung's body, but with his last breath, Glaurung removes the spell from Nienor and tells her that she's married to her long-lost brother. Horrified, Nienor throws herself off a cliff, and when Turin wakes up and learns the truth, he also finally seeks death, falling on his own sword. The story of Turin is not just unfortunate, it's rife with bad timing, terrible improbable chances, and no-win scenarios. As in many of the legends and folktales it draws on, the harder Turin struggles against the idea that Morgoth controls his life, the more his actions backfire, until eventually his very attempts to defeat or evade the curse are what bring the curse to fruition. Thus, as is often the case in stories about destiny, there's a real question about what the curse entails. To what extent is the so-called curse a self-fulfilling prophecy? How much of Turin's misery is due to supernatural meddling, and how much is the natural consequence of his own proud or impulsive choices? The ambiguity is an important literary element of the story, but it's also possible to derive some concrete answers here. Conveniently, the tale of Turin takes place in Middle-earth and concerns the actions of Morgoth, and we have a lot of information on how exactly destiny, prophecies, free will, and corruption work in that context. First, we need to look at just what Morgoth claims he's going to accomplish through the curse. In the very condensed version found in the Silmarillion, Morgoth merely tells Hurin, "Sit now there and look out upon the lands where evil and despair shall come upon those whom thou lovest." And this is pretty vague. Morgoth merely claims that terrible things will happen to Hurin's family, which is kind of a given in the wake of the Nirnaeth Arnoediad. But Turin's woe clearly goes beyond the ordinary grief and misery that affects pretty much everyone in Beleriand. and the longer version of Morgoth's conversation with Hurin in Unfinished Tales explains why the anguish of Hurin's children is so particularly painful. Morgoth is irritated by Hurin's refusal to be at all daunted by Morgoth's threats or tempted by his offers of mercy. He snarls that Hurin and his whole family shall be broken on my will, though you are all made of steel. Behold, the shadow of my thought shall lie upon them wherever they go, and my hate shall pursue them to the ends of the world. Hurin calls BS on this, saying that Morgoth can't actually control his family. Morgoth retorts that he's the mightiest of the Valar and can do what he wants. The shadow of my purpose lies upon Arda, and all that is in it bends slowly and surely to my will. But upon all whom you love my thought shall weigh as a cloud of doom, and it shall bring them down into darkness and despair. Wherever they go, evil shall arise. Wherever they speak, their words shall bring ill counsel. Whatsoever they do shall turn against them. They shall die without hope, cursing both life and death. So Morgoth claims not only that Hurin's children will suffer, but that they will bring evil along with them, and everything they try to do will lead to greater woe and the furtherance of Morgoth's purposes. Furthermore, he claims that he can accomplish this by bending his will upon them. Hurin maintains that Morgoth is a liar, which he certainly is, but like all good liars, he's included some grains of truth here. One undeniable element in Turin's curse that can be traced back to Morgoth is the corruption of mankind. After Melkor's marring of creation during the music of the Ainur, no part of Arda is wholly free from his destructive tendencies. But in the Silmarillion, Tolkien describes men as being particularly prone to evil after some mysterious interference by Morgoth at the dawn of their species. The elves perceived clearly that a darkness lay upon the hearts of men, even in the people of the elf friends whom they first knew. Thus, Hurin's family, along with all the humans they come into contact with, have some proclivity toward making decisions that further Morgoth's will. The elves, as a whole, are not subject to this pervasive corruption, but the main actors in the First Age are Noldor, who have been cozened by the lies of Morgoth in ways they don't fully understand. Through the arrogance and avarice Morgoth instilled in them, they have incurred the doom of the Noldor, which is quite similar to the Curse of Turin, except applied to the whole people. So most of the elves Turin encounters are also swayed by their own self-inflicted destiny. We can't overlook Morgoth's more mundane, but no less overwhelming, power to spread woe and exert force on others as the original Dark Lord. There may not be anything mystical about innumerable hosts of vicious armed orcs, but that doesn't mean Morgoth can't use them to limit Turin's options. If we return to Tolkien's thoughts on elvish ideas about fate, we find the related terms and concepts of Ambar and Umbar. I got into how some of this works in my video on Oaths and Curses that you can find here. Ambar refers to those components of one's fate that are due to the conditions of the world as it is found. Much as he might like to, Turin can't avoid the fact that his actions will be determined by, say, the position of certain landforms, or the unfortunate effects of hastily loosed arrows on the torsos of dwarven scions. And Morgoth, along with the other Valar, was one of the wills involved in setting these conditions in the first place. As a Vala, Morgoth has great knowledge of the material processes that control the world. Not only has his discord given everything in Arda a greater or lesser susceptibility to his corruption, he's further cemented this control by dispersing much of his will into the world, lessening his innate personal power for the sake of greater influence. The concept Tolkien summarizes by saying the whole of Middle-earth was Morgoth's ring. So it's quite within Morgoth's power to do things like sending the plague that has already killed Turin's first sister, Lalaith, calling up a storm to make Beleg's rescue of Turin just that much more slippery and chaotic, or loosening the rock that falls on Turin's ally, Hunthor. I'm not saying any of these necessarily were the direct work of Morgoth, but they are things that he would have been capable of. And those are just the obvious examples. Tolkien notes that a lot of the Valar's power over Arda is due to their subtlety, as well as their might. This habitation might seem a little thing to those who consider only the immeasurable vastness of the world, which still the Ainur are shaping, and not the minute precision to which they shape all things therein. True, Morgoth isn't exactly known for his patience and delicacy at this point, but we underestimate him at our peril. The guy knows exactly which beat of a butterfly's wings will lead to a tornado 3 years down the line. He's capable of tracking and adjusting an insane number of variables. And this has implication for Umbar, the network of coincidences arising from the interaction of individual wills with the physical conditions of the world. An example of this is Turin and Nianor's meeting. Nianor doesn't end up on Hadlanelith by trying to find Turin, she's been running in mindless terror. Her course is, in one sense, under her control, in that she's the one deciding which way to run. But on the other, given her goals to escape the nearby orcs, and the layout of the trees and landscapes of Brethil, there are only so many ways she can go. These factors, which are beyond her control, all literally shape her path to lead to a meeting with her long-lost brother, something the elves would probably consider fated, somehow an inevitable result of the laws of physics and causality set into motion at the dawn of time, regardless of the degree to which the two did or did not intend it. Their decision to marry, on the other hand, being a conscious and intended action, is not part of Umbar, and while their ignorance of certain highly pertinent facts diminishes any moral blame, their wills are the ones responsible for the consequences. The Valar, including Morgoth, all had a hand in shaping Umbar during the music, but of course so did Eru, who conceived of the whole thing to begin with, and after the beginning of the world it is unclear how much the Valar can influence these predetermined events. Certainly they're not supposed to meddle too much, but Morgoth isn't really about following these guidelines, so we hear that, except for Melkor, and those he dominated, the wills of the Ainur being in accord with Eru affected little change in Ambar or deflected Umbar. This implies that Morgoth, being more willing to meddle, did have some effect on not only Ambar, but Umbar too. So, to an extent, Morgoth can back up his bragging. He's more than capable of ensuring that Túrin, Morwen, and Nienor will suffer simply through his military control of Beleriand and the malevolence of his soldiers, spies, allies, and monsters. Moreover, he can turn nature itself against them. He can rely on the immoral tendencies now inherent in the hearts and wills of all men and most of the relevant elves to ensure that at least some of Túrin's deeds and the deeds of those around him will ultimately serve Morgoth's purposes, and he has both the power and the willingness to at least attempt to warp the predetermined events of Túrin's life. But as Hurin points out, Morgoth's control is far from complete. For one thing, Morgoth's will is not the only one at work in Arda. The rest of the Valar are doing their best to counteract his damages wherever possible. The lembas Melian makes from the corn of Yavanna provides an unlikely source of strength to Túrin and his band of outlaws. The waters of Ivrin, guarded from defilement by Ulmo Lord of Waters, heals Túrin's madness after Beleg's death. Not everything in Middle-earth tends toward evil. Beyond the Valar, there's Eru, who rarely intervenes directly into Arda's history, but does ultimately control the whole outcome, and famously reminds Melkor after the discord that no theme may be played that hath not its uttermost source in me, nor can any alter the music in my despite, for he that attempteth this shall prove but mine instrument, in the devising of things more wonderful which he himself hath not imagined. One suspects that Túrin at least would take exception to his fate being described as a thing more wonderful, but the point remains that Melkor does not have absolute control over the outcome of anything he sets into motion. And there's the question of the children of Eru themselves, elves and men and their elder adoptive siblings, the dwarves, who, as Eru's direct creations, possess independent life and inviolable free will. The children of Eru are so called because, while a part of the music as a whole, they were not a part of the themes sung by the Ainur, and therefore could not be manipulated like the rest of existence. The minds of the children were not open to the Valar except by the free will of the children, and could not be invaded or violated by the Valar except with disastrous consequences, their breaking and enslaving. This is why Morgoth is bothering with the curse in the first place. He cannot simply take control of Hurin and force the location of Gondolin out of him. He hasn't been able to cow Hurin, so he's trying to dishearten him by demonstrating the extent of his control over the world. The tricky part here is that Morgoth's control over the world does not extend to controlling Túrin's will, or indeed the wills of any of the people he becomes entangled with. The wills and desires, and the resultant deeds of the elves remained forever in some measure unpredictable to the Valar. This was even more evident in the case of men. The bizarre coincidences and generally terrible circumstances that Túrin finds himself in may be under Morgoth's control, but his actions and the reactions of those around him are not. And so Túrin does bear responsibility for some of the apparent effects of the curse. Indeed, throughout the story, Tolkien is at pains to emphasize this. There's Hurin's conversation with Morgoth, in which Hurin points out that Morgoth doesn't have ultimate power over the narrative, and reiterates that Morgoth is a liar and his claims cannot be trusted. There's moment after moment where Túrin, Morwen, and Nienor are shown wavering on the cusp of a decision, and are counseled or even implored to choose another path. Of course, sometimes their momentous decisions are guided by pity or love, but others are made out of pride, wrath, fear, and self-loathing. While all their choices tend to result in tragedy, the ones motivated by their negative impulses are the ones that bring the greatest harm to others, and are the ones they most bitterly regret. Morgoth isn't the one who makes Túrin humiliate and terrify Syros until he leaps into a ravine. Morgoth isn't the one who proudly refuses Thingol's pardon and manipulates Beleg into staying with him and his merry band of outlaws. Morgoth certainly isn't the one who demands the people of Nargothrond build a bridge so that orcs can be killed more efficiently. Morgoth probably isn't even particularly happy about the immediate results of some of these decisions, except insofar as they do result in Turin bringing harm to others, and becoming more embittered, more paranoid, and more disgusted with himself. This eventually creates a self-reinforcing cycle. The greater Turin's guilt and fear, the more desperate he becomes to do something, anything right, leading to more impulsive and self-serving actions that, no surprise, tend to harm others, which only makes Turin more frantic. There's 3 more points that must be considered, where Turin's control of his own destiny and Morgoth's observable power intersect. First of all, Morgoth lets it be known that Hurin's kin is under a curse, even parading new captives in front of the tormented man. Morgoth can't directly plant thoughts in Turin's head, but the power of speech is such that he can still influence Turin's beliefs, and thus his behavior, by starting this rumor. There's also the question of Turin's personality. Writers are especially fond of the phrase, "character is destiny," the idea that one's desires and emotions, which influence behavior, are rarely under one's complete control. The elves are noted to dispute this. That aspect of things which we might include in fate, the determination that we each carry about with us in our given created character, which later acts and experience may modify but not fundamentally change, was not included in Umbar by the Eldar, who said that if it was in any way similar, it was on a different plane. Turin has many strengths: pity, loyalty, courage, and intelligence, but these are combined with traits that would probably create challenges for him even under the best possible circumstances. He's mercurial, quick to wrath, impulsive, proud, and stubborn. In many of these traits, he resembles one or the other of his parents. His father Hurin is likewise quick to both pity and anger, and his mother is iron-willed and haughty. Plus, Turin's early life was remarkably traumatizing, even before Hurin and Morgoth engage in their deeply unfortunate battle of wills. His beloved baby sister dies, his mother does not handle her grief in a healthy way, his father is often absent, both parents regularly harp on him about his duties as the heir of the House of Hador, and at the age of 9 he leaves his home and family and becomes a war refugee raised in a totally foreign society. So it's hard not to consider part of the curse of Turin to be his own wounded personality, itself a product of genetics, the choices of his parents, and the particular misfortune of being born in the north of Beleriand on the eve of Morgoth's most comprehensive military triumph. Emotions aren't decisions, and Turin can, and arguably should have, restrained his impatience, anger, and self-regard. But these kinds of psychological factors can also have cognitive and perceptual effects that can actually determine how Turin interprets events. To make matters more confusing, as incarnates, elves and men are reliant on the matter that Morgoth has corrupted, providing yet another avenue for him to encourage evil. Those who had bodies nourished by the Hroa of Arda had, as it were, a tendency, small or great, towards Melkor. They were none of them wholly free of him in their incarnate form, and their bodies had an effect upon their spirits. This sounds a lot like Middle-earth's version of neuropsychology. If there's a little bit of Ode to Morgoth in Turin's very nervous system, this gives Morgoth yet another avenue to influence the poor guy's decisions. And finally, there's the sadistic dragon Glaurung, who, animated by his master's purpose, appears to dominate both Turin and Nienor in such a way as to seal their fates. This really looks like the strongest evidence for Hurin's children being powerless victims before the shadow of Morgoth's thought. Except it can't be that simple. Tolkien maintains that pure mind control is not possible in Middle-earth. Instead, one can only try to compel the consent of another's will with such pressures as fear, pain, despair, or anger, or, as in Turin's case, deceit. The way Glaurung gets into his head is by preying on his love for his family, his desire for his father's approval, and the guilt that haunts him. He calls Turin thankless fosterling, outlaw, slayer of thy friend, thief of love, usurper of Nargothrond, captain foolhardy, and deserter of thy kin. And technically all those things are true, though most of them are also unavoidable, accidental, or both. The effect of this so-called dragon spell is that Turin hearkened to his words, and he saw himself as in a mirror misshapen by malice, and loathed that which he saw. It's the emotional damage of facing the worst possible interpretation of his past deeds that paralyzes Turin, destroying his self-image and making the rest of Glaurung's intimations seem plausible, even though dragons are infamously untrustworthy. And from this point on, his decisions become more and more destructive, because he's gone from hating Morgoth to hating himself. As obsession with his curse consumes him, his choices have fewer and fewer good effects, and coincidence plays less and less of a role in bringing about his doom. And, even if we admit that Glaurung might be able to legitimately overwhelm any trace of Turin's resistance to this onslaught, something I would contest, there's the fact that Turin goes out of his way to look in Glaurung's eyes to prove his valor. So again, this whole situation is the result of a choice on Turin's part. In the end, it is Turin who bears responsibility for the specific results of his decisions. If there were any doubt, remember that Tolkien gave him the name Turambar, Master of Doom, the same title that Morgoth claimed in his dialogue with Hurin. It's a name mostly known for its apparent irony, but Tolkien doesn't throw names around casually. And for Hurin, the most humbling experience is being proven right. Morgoth doesn't have control over the will of men, but in the end, he doesn't need it. His power is sufficient to cause tremendous external suffering, eviscerating the emotions and devastating the wisdom of even the noble and the valiant. It's true that between his character, his upbringing, and the terrible luck that Morgoth can impose on him, Turin was never going to have a fun life. But what makes his life and death so bitter is that he knows his freely made and avoidably bad choices were the deciding factor in compounding his own and everyone else's agony. And Hurin is so soured by this that he spreads further chaos after his family's death, doing Morgoth's work for him and continuing the so-called curse even though his children are finally free of it. So Morgoth doesn't need to be able to control people's destinies when he can far more easily control their outlook. If you, somehow, enjoyed this very grim video, hit the like button and share it around with other Middle-earth masochists. Subscribe if you want to hear more about Morgoth ruining everything, because, spoiler alert, that's kind of the plot of the whole Legendarium. And thank you for watching.